Now I have the honor and the privilege to introduce a friend of mine, a very distinguished colleague in gynecological cancer. Susan Banerjee comes from Royal Marsden from UK, and we are waiting for her presentation. Susan, welcome to Athens.
Thank you very much. So I apologise in advance because I was the lady sneezing in the front row. So you may. I've got a bit of a cold, and it's been a bit of a difficult time recently. So I just want to thank the organising committee, and in particular Michaelis. It was very interesting for me to hear about lung cancer because I specialise in gynaecological cancers, and we've got a long way to go with regards to the role of immunotherapy, I would say, in a nutshell. And I'd like to show you some of the evidence so far and how we put it into practice, or where we could potentially put it into practice if successful in gynaecological cancers. Here are my disclosures. So I'm going to start with ovarian cancer. So unfortunately, as you know, the majority of women are diagnosed with advanced ovarian cancer. And the standard of care is a combination of surgery, chemotherapy, and also the addition of Bevacizumab, which was the first targeted therapy back in 2011 to be licensed, in a gynecological cancer, so ovarian cancer. But the issue we know is that recurrent ovarian cancer is not curable. So if we have any chance of increasing the cure rate, it actually is in the first line setting, as it stands today. So what about recurrent ovarian cancer? Well, platinum, so traditionally we've divided it into platinum-sensitive and platinum-resistant disease, and that terminology has changed in the last year, and hence I've written it on this slide. When platinum is considered a good option, so you give platinum-based chemotherapy with or without Bevacizumab, followed by maintenance PARP inhibitors, which has really transformed the management of ovarian cancer. So that's olaparib, niraparib, and rucaparib. And when platinum isn't a good option, so at that stage where we have single-agent chemotherapy with the addition of Bevacizumab potentially and clinical trials. But where we stand today, the progression-free survival ranges between 2 and 5 months, and overall survival is just over a year. So this slide is probably about 5 years old now that I put together with my colleague, who many of you may know, Professor Stan Kay, who retired when I joined 7 years ago. And ovarian cancer is a heterogeneous disease. Yet look at all these potential drivers or molecular aberrations associated with these subtypes, yet they all get treated, at least the epithelial ovarian cancers, with carboplatin and paclitaxel. So what about immunotherapy? Well, George Koukos and colleagues, and he's at Lausanne now, published over 15 years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine the potential of intraepithelial tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes to predict outcome in ovarian cancer. And there's been consistency in these reports over the years, and what we also see is that there's a difference in TILs among certain histological subtypes. So there is a potential and a rationale for immunotherapy and chemotherapy. You've heard it already in lung cancer and genitourinary cancers, potentially at a basic level, increasing release of tumor antigens, increasing TIL and PD-L1 expression, and inducing immunogenic cell death. And with neoadjuvant chemotherapy, so that's carboplatin and paclitaxel prior to surgery, or a view to surgery, we can see changes in PD-L1 expression with neoadjuvant chemotherapy. And what about HR deficiency? So as you know, in ovarian cancer, BRCA mutations and also this concept of homologous recombination deficiency has really been the driver in many of the clinical trials, leading to practice-changing approvals, both FDA and EMA and globally. So what about potentially immunotherapy in this setting? Well, we now have evidence that women with BRCA mutated high-grade serous ovarian cancer have increased PD-1 and PD-L1 expression compared with HR proficient high-grade serous ovarian cancer. And HR deficiency is associated with a higher neoantigen load, and lower neoantigen load is associated with worse overall survival. So one could hypothesize a reason for combination therapy, for example. And you would have seen and be very familiar with this slide with other cancers, and I've just highlighted where gynecological cancers sit, looking at TMB mutational burden across cancers. We're not there, with melanoma and lung cancer and bladder cancer that you've heard about already. You can see with these boxes where ovary, uterus, and cervical cancer sits, but potential is there. So here we see the data so far. This is the data of some early phase trials with PD-1 and PD-L1 inhibitors in ovarian cancer. And as you can see with Nivolumab, but also Pembrolizumab, there is a response rate, and you can see the waterfall plot there with Nivolumab, but you're basically looking at between 10 and 15%. So this study was published in JCO a number of years ago, looking at platinum-resistant ovarian cancer with Nivolumab. And the overall response rate was 15%. But let's put this into context compared to some of the other malignancies that are more common that you probably treat. With platinum-resistant ovarian cancer, the response rate in the literature is around 10 to 15%. In my experience, and also in the literature, with weekly paclitaxel, it's somewhat higher, potentially up to 30%, but the reports really range from 4 to 30% or so. So 15% in these early phase studies are potentially encouraging. In particular, I want to point out clear cell carcinoma, because we all know that unfortunately the prognosis of women with recurrent clear cell ovarian cancer is dismal, and chemotherapy is not so effective. And that's probably an understatement. So seeing a complete response in a woman with clear cell ovarian cancer is encouraging. Again, PFS about 3 months, but overall survival here in this small study was about 20 months. And I've told you in this setting, overall survival is usually about a year or so. So encouraging early phase data. And also here I've just shown you with Pembrolizumab that response rates in this rare subtype clear cell carcinoma showing a signal there. So this summarizes where we are today: Ipilimumab, Nivolumab, Pembro, Nivolumab, Atezolizumab. Again, response rates, as I'm saying, is not so high, but needs to be taken into context. So around just below 10% to around 15, 16%. And more recently, the Keynote 100 Pembrolizumab study, according to response rates, according to prior lines of therapy, I'd say rather disappointingly in the ovarian cancer world, showing a response rate of about 7%, but duration. So it's not just about response rate, it's about duration of response of just over 8 months, and potentially a signal in heavily pretreated 4 to 6 prior lines of therapy there. So it was very interesting for me to hear Professor Pelled's talk with regards to dividing response according to PD-1 or TMB and such. These are low response rates, but in ESMO 2018, my colleague Professor Lederman reported a CPS score, so looking at PD-L1 staining in the tumor, the lymphocytes and also the macrophages. And there was a suggestion that with a CPS score of more than 10 compared to 1, there was higher response rates, so potentially biomarkers coming through that we clearly need to work on. I'd like to highlight this study because based on the hype across malignancies of immunotherapy, there was the JAVELIN 200 ovarian study, a phase 3 study of Nivolumab alone or in combination with PLD versus PLD alone in patients with platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. This recruited very well across the world, and including in our center. And as you see here, that was the design. But we heard in a press release in November 18 that there was no benefit in PFS or OS, and the results will be presented in March. But just to say, along with this press release, it was quite clear that the response rates were low. The response rate with immunotherapy alone was about 3%. Interestingly, with PLD alone, 4%, which is standard of care. And there was an improvement in response rate with the combination, but going to just above 10% or so. So that was immunotherapy, PD-L1, PD-L1 inhibitors alone effective, but in combination with PLD. So what about other immunotherapy combinations relevant to gynecological cancers? So Bevacizumab, PARP inhibitors. There is some preclinical rationale and early phase data to support the combination of anti-angiogenic therapy with immunotherapy, and also with PARP inhibitors. With PARP inhibitors, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read this slide, but just to say, PARP inhibitors can, increase DNA damage and mutational load, in particular in BRCA-mutated ovarian cancer, and as we've heard already today, high tumor mutation loads expected to elevate neoantigen, and therefore the potential for tumor immunogenicity and accumulation of TILs, and therefore triggering an anti-tumor immune response with this combination. So that has led to a host of studies in gynecological cancer. So this is in recurrent ovarian cancer, looking at carboplatin combinations with Bevacizumab and also Atezolizumab, and we very much hope that these results will be through in the next year or so. And stratification according to PD-1 expression. There's also a US study of PLD with Atezo and/or Bevacizumab in platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the details of these studies, but to give you a flavor and overview of what's happening in the field. What we did here this year from my colleague Joyce Liu from Dana-Farber in ESMO this year, and I was privileged to be the track chair of ESMO 2018 for gynecological cancers, we saw the first results of Bevacizumab in combination with immunotherapy, and that was Nivolumab. And what we see here is that the overall response rate in platinum-resistant disease was about 17%, in sensitive disease 40%. And it's not just about response, as we've heard already, but it's about duration of response and prolongation of stable disease in a disease where any of you who've treated ovarian cancer know how important it is to hold the disease for as long as possible, given the symptoms and tumor burden. The median PFS was 8 months, so encouraging and I think very supportive of looking at combinations of immunotherapy with anti-angiogenic therapy, so non-chemo combinations. So this is the EORTC 1508 study, led basically on the basis of George Koukos's preclinical hypotheses, looking at Atezolizumab, Bevacizumab, and also the addition of aspirin in platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. And I'm privileged to have recently been asked to take over as study coordinator from a clinical perspective of this study, and I've been part of this study and UK chief investigator for a number of years. On the basis of JAVELIN 200, we have stopped the Atezolizumab alone arms. This is a signal-searching phase 2 study, and therefore I think it's important to look at the right combinations and also biopsies to learn the most from this disease. So what about PARP inhibitors and anti-PD-1? I've talked about the rationale. There is some preclinical data supporting the combinations here, as you can see, in vitro and also in vivo. This is a case series published last year of Nivolumab in BRCA-mutated ovarian cancer. It's retrospective, limitations there, but interesting to see that there were 3 complete responses and 1 partial responses in this BRCA-mutated platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. So interesting signals. This is a subset analysis of the Keynote 100, looking at biomarker evaluation. This is Pembrolizumab according to HRD or BRCA mutation status. And what we see here is not really a difference between wild type or mutations in terms of response there. So much the same. So interesting signals. There are a host of PARP inhibitor and immunotherapy combinations studies undergoing at the moment with niraparib, pembrolizumab, olaparib, durvalumab, and rucaparib and atezolizumab, and we're taking part in a number of these studies. So there are some very interesting signals coming through, but we really need to watch this space. In terms of beyond phase 1 and early phase 2, there's the ANITA study looking at atezolizumab followed by maintenance niraparib in recurrent ovarian cancer, platinum sensitive. So building on the license of PARP inhibitors, adding in immunotherapy. And I'd like to mention this study that is open in the US and just opened in the UK. This is the first study looking at treatment for PARP inhibitor-resistant ovarian cancer, patients that are now coming through that are resistant to maintenance therapies, and looking at the combination as a treatment of an ATR inhibitor So the Merck Serrano ATR inhibitor M6620 and the PD-L1 inhibitor Velimab, and also carboplatin, versus standard of care, which is platinum-based chemotherapy. And I'm very keen to see what this early phase study will pan out to look like, and privileged to be leading that. So what about first-line ovarian cancer? Bevacizumab is standard of care. The use of it varies across the world. So I appreciate EMA approval. I'm sure what you'll be using is looking at bevacizumab in combination with chemo and as a maintenance therapy in all comers with advanced ovarian cancer. In England, we use this in high-risk patients, so stage 4, or those that didn't get to surgery or had residual disease left behind. But even within our small country, in Scotland, for example, the license and approvals are different to in England. My personal viewpoint is that I'd like to use bevacizumab in recurrent ovarian cancer, but I'm not able to in the National Health Service in England in recurrent disease, as it's not approved and funded. So I've talked about bevacizumab and the rationale there. What's really been practice changing was presented at ESMO 2018, and this was in the presidential session looking at maintenance olaparib for BRCA-mutated ovarian cancer, and we published this concurrently during the presentation in the New England Journal of Medicine. And this is what's been so practice-changing. So here you see the placebo arm, and there you see olaparib. And what is clear is a hazard ratio of 0.3, so a 70% improvement. And that translates to a median progression-free survival of about 13 months in the placebo arm versus to around 3 years or so in the olaparib arm. So meaningful clinical and statistical differences. So what else is happening in the first-line setting? Well, there's the JAVELIN 100 study, where patients received chemo, standard of care, carboplatin paclitaxel, observation, or the combination with avelumab or chemo and avelumab maintenance therapy. And rather disappointingly, there was a press release in December, at the end of last year, where the interim analysis led to the trial being terminated. Patients had been fully recruited, we participated in that, but there were patients still undergoing maintenance therapy, and we were told that we needed to stop that. So disappointing. There are a number of other first-line studies here, the IMAGINE study, looking at the combination of bevacizumab and immunotherapy, atezolizumab. And there's about to be at least 5, maybe 6 first-line ovarian cancer studies. So ovarian cancer is not as common as lung cancer or prostate cancer. It's relatively rare. So over 5,000 women or so, I imagine, will be subjected to combinations with bevacizumab, PARP inhibitors, immunotherapy. I very much hope we can learn something from this. Translation research is key, but also designing studies. And it's disappointing seeing the JAVELIN results so far. And this needs to be reflected, I'd say, in the trial designs here. So let's move on to endometrial cancer. Lots happened in endometrial cancer. Endometrial cancer is not one disease now. We recognize poly hypermutated, microsatellite unstable, so hypermutated, and copy number high and copy number low. This is the Keynote 028 study with the endometrial cancer cohort. And there's 24 patients treated, 74 screened to look at PD-L1 positive endometrial cancer. 1 was MSI, high, 18 stable, and the response rate was 13%. But let's look at the actual spider plots here. There clearly are some patients that are benefiting, and we need to identify those more. And then there was Pembrolizumab, patients with advanced MSI high or mismatch repair deficient cancers, not just endometrial cancer. This is all cancers. And the response rate was around 40%. And endometrial cancer, low numbers, but again, consistent, about 36%. Pembrolizumab was approved by the FDA in May 17, and it was tumor agnostic, so it included access to women with endometrial cancer which would fit this cohort. At ESMO this year, the GARNET study, so Tesaro, PD-1 inhibitor TSR042 results were presented in endometrial cancer. And look at this plot of responses. We don't really see that with advanced recurrent endometrial cancer. response rate of 52%. This is very encouraging and very exciting to see in endometrial cancer. I'd also like to mention Lenvatinib and Pembrolizumab. Lenvatinib is a VEGF receptor tyrosine kinase inhibitor. We don't see these waterfall plots in recurrent endometrial cancer. And what's interesting here is that it's not just limited to MSI or PD-L1 status, and therefore very, very encouraging results that need more exploration. But based on this phase 2 study published or presented at ASCO last year, there was a breakthrough designation granted by the FDA in 2018. This has led to the need for the phase 3 study, Keynote 775, which is comparing this combination of Pembrolizumab and Lenvatinib versus standard of care, which is doxorubicin or paclitaxel. And this study is ongoing, as you can see. There's the MANGO Italian-led study of chemotherapy plus Atezolizumab and maintenance therapy in recurrent endometrial cancer that has started recruiting. And I'd like to now move on to cervical cancer, because I appreciate I'm what's stopping you for lunch. So we'll move swiftly on to cervical cancer. So Pembrolizumab in advanced cervical cancer. Well, just remind ourselves, cervical cancer is generally HPV-driven, at least in squamous cell carcinoma. One would expect, at least hypothesize, great results with immunotherapy in cervical cancer. And it's a dismal disease with response rates which are too poor. We published the Royal Marsden series a number of years ago. In recurrent cervical cancer, response rates are less than 10%. What has changed practice a couple of years ago, the GOG 240 study, which was the addition of Bevacizumab to carboplatin and paclitaxel. And it is small steps forward with a survival advantage of 13 months to 16 months with the addition of Bevacizumab. And that's important, these little steps, because that's the way we're going to move forward in this horrible disease. So this is beyond the next recurrence. Pembrolizumab, 24 patients, PD-L1 positive, response rate 17%, median response duration 5.4 months. That may sound bad, but those of you that see women with cervical cancer, usually PFS is about 2 months or so. So the key thing is that those women that have had responses, they can be quite durable in this disease. So Keynote 158, Pembrolizumab cervical cancer cohort, 98 patients, 83% PD-L1 positive, response rate 13%, all in PD-L1 positive cervical cancer, PFS 2 months, overall survival 9 months. That appeared to be sufficient to get FDA approval in June, which kind of shows you how desperate we are, in my point of view, for better treatments. So it is FDA approved in PD-L1 positive recurrent cervical cancer. We clearly need to do better. Of course, based on these early phase studies now, we need to do a randomized study. So there's Pembrolizumab versus investigator's choice of chemotherapy, whatever that may be, in recurrent cervical cancer, and that trial is ongoing. There's also the ENGOT study, BEAT-CC, which is in primary advanced cervical cancer, cisplatin, Taxol, Avastin, plus Atezolizumab, and let's watch this space. There's also another drug called Semipilimab versus investigator's choice. So lots going on with immunotherapy versus chemotherapy in cervical cancer. So what are the challenges? Well, I think some of them are shared with other cancers that you've heard about today. We need better biomarkers. Clearly, you've heard of much better biomarkers in lung cancer, for example. We need to look and interrogate more microsatellite instability, high tumor mutation burden, also looking at the T-cell inflamed microenvironment, so integrating PD-L1 expression, gene signatures of T-cell activation. And there's a publication in Science earlier this year alluding to that. We need rational combinations, in my view, not just chucking drugs together, because you've seen already the impact of negative large studies. Treatment duration, how long should we be treating? Should we just give a few doses of immunotherapy and that will then have an effect in some of these cancers? What endpoints are important in immunotherapy clinical trials, and how do we best manage toxicities? We are much better at that now, given the fact that in routine practice across other cancers, you're using this in daily practice. But there's also the big answer of cost across these malignancies. How are we actually going to fund these treatments, potentially Avastin plus PARP inhibitors, plus immunotherapy in the first-line setting? I'd like to end to acknowledge my team and also my mentor and inspiration to not only me, but many internationally and nationally. Unfortunately, my colleague, Professor Martin Gore, CBE, passed away unexpectedly. I was meant to be covering his annual leave this week. And unfortunately, he died following a yellow fever vaccine, and I was at his funeral earlier this week, and I wasn't even sure if I was going to get to this meeting. But I very much like his words, and what we should all remember is I want to remember and pay tribute to my patients and their families, who through their courage and determination have inspired me. So let's not forget patients' families and the importance of teaching and implementing the next generation of oncologists. So thank you for your attention.
Susan, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. We do not have any questions, but since I'm a bit biased with Susan, I'm also the chair of the Congress, so I have the privilege to give her an honor because I think she represents the best example of a succeeded woman in oncology because have a well-balanced, very successful professional life, a very quiet and very lovely family.
Thank you.
Dear Susan.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. And I must say, I wanted to thank your country and for your hospitality. And I have a number of fellows who come from Greece to have some fellowships at the Royal Marsden, and one of my team and others, and it's always a pleasure having